Radyo, 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 Katipunan, radyo, Katipunan, radyo, Katipunan, radyo, 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 Katipunan, radyo, Katipunan. The voice of the Eagle, kami di mapipigil sa pagbabalitang tumpak at tama. Buhay Atenista, sa loob sa labas ng eskwela, ating ibibida lahat ng eskwela. Radyo, radyo, Katipunan, radyo, 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 Katipunan, radyo, Katipunan, Katipunan. Kawal ni Ignacio, Katipunero sugo, todo sa kayod, tunong at tulong. Lipad na Blue Eagle, galing hiding at tigil, blue and white, one big fight. Radyo, 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 Katipunan, radyo, 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 Katipunan, radyo, Katipunan, radyo, Katipunan.
Meron? Ano nga ba ang meron? Paano nga bang mabuhay ng tapat sa meron? Don't you wish you can relive your Philo classes? The terror teachers? The terrible oral exams? Or the even terrifying but liberating and life-changing aha moments? Lundagin Mo Beybeh! Here's your chance! Lundagin Mo Beybeh! Kasama ang mga pilosopong sina Jovy Miroy at Capinding. Lundagin Mo Beybeh! Leaping upward, leaping forward. Lundagin Mo Beybeh! Leaping to greater heights, to greater wisdom, to greater magis. Lundag na, Ateneo!
Hey, good afternoon. It's me, Dr. Jovy Miroy, without Sir Capinding. For this afternoon, we have a special treat for you guys. It's part of the plenary sessions of the philosophy department. Our classes in the Introduction to Philosophy, or the Philosophy of the Human Person. And we're going to discuss something very interesting, and it's the emotions and the affections and their role in being human. Now, these are actually 4 episodes, and they're prepared by our young teachers. Today's episode will be on Aristotle, and it was prepared by King Palmea. And he worked so hard to bring this episode to you. He prepared a PowerPoint and is going to deliver the lecture, the mini lecture, in a few minutes after this short introduction. But so that's Aristotle in the first episode. It will be followed by the show on Descartes, and after that will be Spinoza and Scheller. So that's Aristotle, Mr. Aristotle, then René Descartes, and Baruch Spinoza, and Max Scheler. Now, after the PowerPoint presentation, there will be an interview with a subject expert. For this afternoon, you're in for a treat. Our subject expert is no less than the legend, Mr. Calasanz. And for the next episodes, it will be for Descartes, Dr. John Bulaong, and for Spinoza, Dr. Paglibar, and for Scheller, no less than Dr. Manny D. So, to present to us the role of emotions and the affects in the philosophy of being human of Aristotle is Mr. King Palmea.
What was the recent thing you still did despite knowing you will feel guilty afterwards? For example, did you play video games despite knowing that it's midterms week? Or perhaps you had a few cigarettes? Or perhaps you ate a chocolate though you are trying to avoid sugars? Or even just procrastinating by scrolling through your FB newsfeed instead of spending time to actually do your papers or to study for your oral exams. Today, we're going to talk about Aristotle and his ideas on the role of our affects. He is one of the first philosophers to recognize our affects, or our ability to feel pain, pleasure, and emotions in the philosophy of the human person. In his ideas, he talks about the role of pleasure and pain and what should be our proper relationship to them. We will discuss in this episode his ideas on the affects based on his two works, The Anima and Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle says that what we see as pleasurable and painful is indicative of the type of person we are. We never listen to pleasures and pain without bribes. We are attracted to those that give us pleasure, and we avoid those that give us pain. This could apply from the most basic level, the senses, but also to our values. We are swayed by our favorite TV shows, favorite food, authors, and even the people we idolize and admire. But we avoid those that harm us or those that displease us, a badly cooked dish, or perhaps a manipulative friend. That's why we unfriend those who are trolling, yet we give heart reacts to our crushes when we see their pictures. It is therefore proper to have a good relationship to pleasure and pain, for they always influence our choices. And what is this proper relationship? Aristotle says we must find pleasure in the good and pain in the bad. But what does he mean by finding pleasure in the good? To understand this, let us begin how Aristotle describes the human being. He says that human beings always do things for the sake of something. For example, I borrow notes from my classmate because I missed a class so that I would be able to study. We always do something with an end in mind. Just as ends and means can be ordered, so are ends. Ends can be ordered too, for some ends are pursued for other ends. We study as a means to pass our tests. We pass our tests to be able to graduate. We want to graduate so we can fulfill whatever career we want to have. We pursue that career to be able to earn a living, etc. Aristotle says that there is this chief good or chief end that we all want to achieve. This chief end is desired for the sake of itself, and everything else is desired for the sake of it. This chief end, or he calls telos, is an organizing principle because everything else is chosen for the sake of it. It is also a unifying principle because it gives us a sense of wholeness, of completeness, and perfection. He calls this eudaimonia. We translate it into English to happiness, or the good life, or human flourishing. We ultimately desire happiness, and we do things for the sake of it, for the sake of our own flourishing, and to be able to live a good life. We ultimately want this wholeness, and this is, for Aristotle, the end goal of the human being. This human flourishing has something to do with the activity appropriate to the human being. What is unique about the human being, according to Aristotle? In order to know this, we should talk about Aristotle's notion of the soul. Now, the soul here is not related to any Christian or any religious concept. Soul for Aristotle is more of a biological concept, something that we study in science. This soul is what enables living beings to do certain activities. Each living being has a particular soul that allows them to engage in activities appropriate to them. Now, for Aristotle, there are three kinds of souls. The first kind is the vegetative soul. This concerns the capacity of a living thing to reproduce, to nourish itself, and for growth. He says that this makes the living things partake in the divine because they're able to nourish themselves but also at the same time reproduce. This is the only kind of soul that the plants have. For Aristotle, the plants can only nourish itself, grow, and reproduce, and nothing else. The second kind of soul is the appetitive part. This concerns the capacity of a living thing to get affected, to feel pleasure and pain. This allows them also to perceive the world around them through the senses: sight, hearing, touch, smell, and taste. This appetitive part is shared both by animals, our dogs, apes, and other animals, and also the human being. This makes us capable of feeling joy and sadness, and we're able to navigate the world through this. Now, what sets the human being apart from all living things? For Aristotle, it's our capacity for reason, the rational part. This concerns our capacity for thought and of thinking things through. And if we can think things through, then that means we can act in accordance with what is right. The rational part of the soul concerns our capacity to deliberate on how to achieve things that would make ourselves flourish. And this is what is unique about the human being. This is the summary of the three parts of the soul of the human being: the vegetative soul, appetitive soul, and the rational soul. Aristotle says that the appetitive part takes part in the rational soul because the appetitive soul is subordinate to the rational part. It is reason that controls our emotions or our desires. It is our mind that says it is wrong to eat sugar too much because it could make us fat. Or it is a reason that says it's wrong to pursue someone who's already in a relationship. It is a reason that says we should not play computer games first because we have a long test to study for. The rational part of the soul orders the desire. Therefore, the desires can be trained to accord with reason, to accord with what is right. We can learn to desire the things that give us fulfillment or purpose, to desire the things good for us that would help us attain our own flourishing. But the appetitive part of the soul only takes part because it's not capable of reason itself, and hence it could go against it. Our desires does not always accord with reason. That's why we have reactions at the heat of the moment that we regret in the end. Now, Aristotle talks about the role of pleasure and pain in our choices. He says that we are always swayed by what is pleasurable and avoid what gives us pain. This does not just apply in terms of food, but also in terms of our preferences in music, but not just in terms of our senses, even in the activities that we do. That's why a religious person is someone who takes delight in praying and finds joy in praying. That's why most images of religious experiences are images of ecstasy or standing out of oneself. Pleasure and pain have pedagogical functions too. They teach us what to avoid and follow. or to imitate. That's why kids learn not to touch a hot kettle, or that drinking a hot chocolate immediately upon serving is not a good idea because it's too hot. Or, for example, when you get hurt in love, you undergo a period where you simply try to avoid falling in love to protect yourself. And so you learn to avoid falling in love to protect yourself. Pleasure teaches us too. Rewards and recognitions and affirmations, not just from others, but from ourselves, reinforce and teach us how to strive for flourishing. What gives us pleasure or pain is an indication of what kind of people we are, not just in terms of our preferences and our hobbies. For example, your favorite food is kare-kare, right? Not just in terms of hobbies, like you like reading books, that's why you're a bibliophile, but also in terms of our character. For example, you study together with your friend, and once you get the results of the exam, your friend gets a higher score than you. Perhaps she gets an A, you get a B+, despite you studying together and you providing all the notes. Are you the type of friend who gets jealous when this friend of yours gets a higher score than you? Or are you the type of person who's genuinely happy that you studied together, and even though she got higher scores than you, you are genuinely happy for your friend? The pleasure and pain we feel is indicative of the type of character that we have. And so for Aristotle, it is therefore necessary to have a proper relationship to our affects. And what is this proper relationship? To find pleasure in the good and pain in the bad. To find pleasure in the good means to take delight in doing things that bring us or help us to attain human flourishing or eudaimonia. We take delight in doing things that make us fulfilled, not the other way around. Not take delight in things that harm us or make us unfree, like addictions and other harmful behaviors.
Thought I'd end up with Sean, but it wasn't a match. Wrote some songs about Ricky, now I listen and laugh. Even almost got married, and for Pete I'm so thankful. Wish I could say thank you to Malcolm, cause he was an angel. One taught me love, one taught me patience, and one taught me pain. Now I'm so amazing to have loved and I've lost, but that's not what I see. So look what I got, look what you taught me. Yeah, for that I say thank you. Next, thank you. Next, thank you. Next, I'm so fucking grateful for my ex. Thank you. Next, thank you. Next, thank you. Next, I'm so fucking spend more time with my friends. I ain't worried about nothing. Plus I met someone else. We having better discussions. I know they say I move on too fast, but this one gon' last. Cause her name is Ari, and I'm so good with that. She taught me patience, how she handles pain. That shit's amazing. I've loved and I lost, but that's not what I see. So look what I found. No need for searching. Yeah, more than I say. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm so fucking grateful for my ex. Thank you, thank you, thank you, so thank you, next. Yeah, I'm so fucking grateful for my ex. Thank you, next. wish it lasts. God forbid something happens. At least this song is a smash. I got so much love, got so much patience. Learned from the pain. Turned out amazing. Turned out amazing. But that's not what I see. Look what I found. Ain't no need for searching. If all that I say, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm so fucking grateful for my ex. Thank you, thank you, thank you, so thank you next. I'm so fucking grateful for my ex. Thank you next. Thank you next. Thank you next. Yeah. Thank you next. Thank you next. Thank you next. Yeah.
That's Thank You Next by Ariana Grande. That song talks about, well, the pedagogical function of pleasure and pain. She recognizes that she learned from the pains of the past, but also she finds joy in things that make her humanity flourish. In this song, the persona, Ariana, finds pleasure in empowering herself.
All right. So I hope you like that song by Ariana Grande. Now we have our interview portion who's going to deepen our understanding of eudaimonia. And if you already see him in your screens, he is the great Eddie Boy Calasanz. So, sir, how are you? How are you today?
Okay.
All right. And so what did you think of the song of Ariana Grande? What happens when we find pleasure in something that can harm us?
Well, first of all, it's not the sort of music I often listen to, so I had to adjust listening to it. But I think that Aristotle gives us a certain insight trying to understand the song, in the sense that pleasure and pain are indicators, but they're not. They do not constitute the reality of happiness. They're like guides which can indicate a certain direction, but they're not the place where we want finally to end up in. So I think that there's something still lacking in that.
So you're saying that the pleasure and the pain are not, they're just guides, but they're not supposed to be the basis for action or for. So how do we then understand his notion of eudaimonia? You know, is that beyond pleasure and pain? So how do you elaborate on the notion of eudaimonia as perfection?
Well, the notion of perfection, of one's accomplishing one's telos as one's end, as Aristotle would put it. There are many ways of talking about it. I would compare it to coming home. What happens when I experience coming home especially after a long and tiring trip? Coming home means being myself. Coming home means I'm not only in a safe place, but I'm in a place where I can truly be myself when I realize my potential. Where I can finally lay down the masks, the roles that I have to play, and just be me. So it's that coming home which is perfection. It's that coming home which is a certain being at ease, not just with myself, but with the world, with others.
in other words, happiness, I think, as Aristotle understood it, is, well, to use another vocabulary, it's being at ease with my being in the world.
So it is not just the sense of being in pleasure or not having pain.
Yes, and it's something more. The pleasure and the pain are indicators, in other words, in the literal sense, in the sense of pointing towards, but it's they're not the, as it were, the real thing yet.
All right. But even so, would the emotions and the affects have a place or importance in achieving that sense of being at home or of?
Yes. In other words, they're very helpful precisely as guides, as indicators. They help us get to know where we are. I think that's the whole point of pleasure. The experiences of pleasure and pain as indicative of our character, of our exis. In other words, of where we are. But where we are is not necessarily where we want to go, where we want to be. So it's in that sense that happiness, that eudaimonia is something more. And yet, precisely our experiences of pleasure and pain can help us, can put us in an attitude of truth. No, this is where I am now. This is where we are now.
All right. The PowerPoint spoke of character, in the sense that what gives you pleasure reveals or in a way is the manifestation of a character. How would you describe your character through what gives you pleasure?
Depends on what you mean by that. The word character is a very fluid one. You can have an Aristotelian understanding of it. You can have a more psychological understanding of it, or even a more poetic understanding of it. But if I were to use Aristotle's framework, character would be somewhat of a certain stability, a certain pattern of my behavior, of my likes or dislikes, of my pleasure and pain. In other words, in all of this, there's a certain pattern, a certain stable pattern. It's not a rigidly fixed pattern, but there's a certain pattern. So if I were to talk about my character, my exis in that sense, what are the patterns in my life? What are which are manifested, for example, in my habitual behavior, my repetitive behavior, my behavior.
The habit. What he calls the habit.
What he calls precisely habit. But I don't like to use. I don't understand the word habit as something you just do out of routine. No.
Yes.
I understand habit as pattern, as a structure, as okay. So
it's character.
Character, precisely. So what are certain manifestations, certain characteristics of this character, which precisely in an attitude of truth helps me to understand where I am. No? Perhaps one way of trying to talk about it is to understand myself, for example, as having certain strengths, certain qualities, also certain weaknesses. Certain strengths, certain qualities. It's always a little difficult to talk of oneself, but anyway, let me try very hard. A certain inclination, a certain love for study. I think that's a quality. I think that's part of my character. I am literally a studious person. Okay. But in terms of my of weaknesses, or what could be characterized as weakness, I have a soft spot for good food.
Oh, you could have fooled me.
Well, appearances can deceive. I have a soft spot.
What kind of food, Sir Eddie Boy?
Well, a while ago, King Palmea talked about kare-kare. I love kare-kare. I love caldereta. I love food with lots of garlic or olive oil.
Would you say that there's a relationship between your love for study and this weakness for good food?
In the sense that both studying and eating involve consuming the world, assimilating the world. In that sense, one can make a connection.
Thank you for sharing, Sir Eddie. But do you have experiences wherein your appetites, on the other hand, go against doing the right thing?
Well, that's even more embarrassing question. But a recent experience, I'm genetically predisposed to diabetes, so I have to be careful with my sugar levels. But I love leche flan, which has a very high sugar level. And so there are moments when there is this struggle between the appetitive part in me and the rational part in me. The rational part in me which tells me be careful, avoid, budget your sugar ratio. And at the same time, the appetitive part, basta't masarap kahit na bawal. So you have that conflict. And finally, the way I resolve that conflict in a decision, in a choice, well, that manifests my real character.
That's where your character shows.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. I hope I think that's very kind of you for sharing.
Well, I hope it can be helpful for others, like even Justin in front of me.
All right. So that ends this first episode of the affects and the emotions in being human. But we still have one more segment, which is the suggested activity by Mr. Palmea.
For our activity, to better understand the things we learned from today's show, I invite everyone to write a journal. So a journal is something where you write your thoughts on a particular theme, a particular thing you did today or thing you learned today. And in your journal, I only have 2 questions for you. Okay? First, by the way, these 2 questions could help us be aware of, like what Sir Calasan said, where we are today by knowing what are the things that give us pleasure and give us pain. So for the first question, what are the things we find pleasurable that we actually recognize as harmful to us? For the second question, what are the things we find pleasurable that we think are helpful for achieving this human flourishing?
All right. So I hope you enjoyed this episode on the affects and emotions in Aristotle. We'll see you again next week. Let me thank again our guests, Mr. Calasans and Mr. Palmea. So we'll see you again next week when we talk about the affects and the emotions in that great son of the Jesuits, René Descartes.
Meron? nga bang mabuhay ng tapat sa meron? Don't you wish you can relive your Philo classes? The terror teachers? The terrible oral exams? Or the even terrifying but liberating and life-changing aha moments? Lundagin Mo Beybeh! Here's your chance! Lundagin Mo Beybeh! Kasama ang mga pilosopong sina Jovy Miroy at Capinding. Lundagin Mo Beybeh! Leaping upward, leaping forward. Lundagin Mo Beybeh! Leaping to greater heights, to greater wisdom, to greater magis. Lundag na, Ateneo!